This is Jennifer Pepito with the Restoration Home podcast. Today on the show, I'm so excited to be chatting with Tabitha Paige. She is the author of the many Tabitha Paige kids books. They feature beautiful watercolor paintings and simple words and stories, and they're such a delightful addition to any family library. Tabitha is also a speech therapist, a brilliant watercolor artist, and I thought it'd be fun to talk a little bit about teaching our children to read gently today with Tabitha. So thanks for joining me today, Tabitha.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here, Jennifer. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's so great to get to chat with you. Your books have been such a delightful addition to our home library. I really value, ever since I started reading about Charlotte Mason, I have put a very high value on the things that we use for teaching our children being lovely. We are training their senses in a way. And
Mm.
so when we show our children books, when we show them music, when we show them nature, all of it is like this culture that we're creating around them. And your books add so much to that culture, especially in an era where a lot of the materials for young children are so cartoonish. I was telling you earlier, we used Bob books in part to teach our children to read, and they have great little short stories, but the illustrations are really not exciting. So I just loved finding your books and how lovely they are. So I just love to hear you talk a little bit about what made you want to start writing those books, even.
Well, I never set out to be an author illustrator. It was definitely not on my life bucket list. It was definitely something that the Lord put in my hands and in my lap. But definitely my background as a speech therapist, primarily working in with early childhood development and children that have special needs. I was really immersed in the setting of teaching children to talk, to read, to learn. And I really got to see firsthand kind of what the world is encouraging more in that public school realm to help our children with development. And I started looking at a lot of the books that were used for those very, very early years, specifically with babies, and realizing, wow, things have really changed in the last few decades. Artwork is not nearly as gentle and meaningful. It seems to be more about flashing colors and bright lights and bells and whistles, which shouldn't be a surprise because this is the direction screen time has gone, toys have gone. A lot of it has to do with marketing. But very little, I believe, is really considering what is so essential for childhood development, considering their sensory needs, their language needs, and then their learning needs.
Wow. And so when you saw that, you really sought to fill that gap.
Absolutely. I distinctly remember standing back in our wonderful speech therapy room, and we had this wall of books. And I remember thinking, there's a few really wonderful books here, but where there's no gentle storytelling with just realistic images that are helping develop our children's real world experience of a picture of a cow, but something really lovely and beautiful that really looks like a cow. Everything really started to turn into this stylized form in children's books, which is great and so much fun for creativity as they grow. But in those really early years when we're teaching development, and then also with children with special needs, we need to be presenting them with meaningful material that means something to their world so that we can go into those creative spaces as they really develop adequate language.
Yeah, I love that. Some of my early, homeschool training that I took on was in Montessori
Mm.
because I read the book, it's Montessori in the Classroom by Paula Polk Lillard. And she described all these different ways that 3-year-olds were interacting with materials and basically teaching themselves to read. And not, everybody was at a different level. So it's not like every 3-year-old was reading, but they had access to, picture word cards. So we have in the Peaceful Press, and similar to you, we have pictures and words that go with them, so that as children are starting to identify things, they can see that words match with pictures, and they can see a real picture of something or a beautifully watercolored picture of something. There was a lot of motor movement in what I was reading about in those Montessori books. And then I also have a child with special needs. And so we were doing all these neurodevelopmental activities, like doing fine motor work and pinching and squeezing and pushing and pulling and all these different large and fine motor activities. Because from what I learned, the brain coordinates around movement.
Absolutely.
And often, like a child who cannot watch a ball coming at them and hit it like a ball on a string, or a
Mhm.
child who cannot lace a lacing card, they're actually not even ready to read because their visual tracking skills aren't there yet. So I'd love to hear, like, how did you decide when your children were ready to read?
Yeah, okay. So this is kind of an interesting journey. So when I was studying as a speech therapist, we learned from the very get-go the importance of play in those early years. As a speech therapist, we were not taught, okay, here's how we're to go about teaching reading. We learned about phonemic and phonetic awareness and how to read to a child. But the very crux of those early years was revolved around play and pretend play. And that goes hand in hand with motor skills, fine motor skills, gross motor skills, and just how our body's moving in space. And all of those things help the brain actually develop. And where my brain started to go, it was really after I read this article. I have since not been able to find it. I feel like it's been scrubbed from the internet, but it was an article about children in a different country. I believe it was Finland, Sweden, one of those countries. And it was talking about how children do not learn to read till they're about 7 or 8 years old. And it's very directed by the child when they're showing reading readiness. Most of those early years are spent doing play activities, pretend play, outdoor play, so a lot of physical activity. And I thought, from what I was learning in school and after reading this article, I was like, that makes so much sense to me. Where's this breakdown? And then if you looked at the data, you see all these countries that read later have higher performing scores later on in their academic years. So that just got me thinking creatively of, okay, maybe there's a different way than what we learned. I was raised in a public school setting. Maybe there's a different way and potentially a more effective way of teaching children to read. So when my child came along, I thought, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to really focus on reading. I'm going to read to her. I'm going to answer any questions she has about any sounds, any words. I will answer anything she asks me, but I'm not going to specifically sit down and drill her on reading skills until she shows me readiness. I'm going to focus on play skills, pretend play skills, cooperative skills, joint attention, all of those things that are priming the brain for some of those more left-brained activities, such as reading, which is more organization. And what I found after I really pushed through some of the peer pressure, why aren't you teaching your child to read? What are you doing? And I thought, no, I'm going to stick to this. I know this feels right intuitively as a parent, as a speech therapist, as a teacher of my child. I know this is right for my child. And I think that's where we really need to pay attention because it is specific to each child. There's not a magic age. It's when is their brain ready?
Mhm.
And I saw my daughter go from not reading at early 7 to a massive leap into chapter books at the end of her seven year. And I barely had to lift a finger. And I don't believe that I'm some magic teacher. And my daughter, she's a smart little girl, but I just believe it was the groundwork that I really laid out for her. Not this, okay, let's do some drills, but okay, we're going to read every single day. We're going to immerse ourselves in early language books. And, as me as a speech therapist, of course, I'm talking to my child every day. We're really developing language. But when it came to reading, I stuck to that. I'm just going to be there for her to answer those questions, and she's going to let me know. And she did. It very evolved very naturally. She'd start pointing to words. What does this say? What does this sound? But it was only after I set that foundation of answering those questions in those 3, 4, 5-year-old years with reading.
Wow. That's so encouraging, I think, for parents because sadly, a lot of moms spend a lot of money and a
Mm,
lot of worry about their children learning to read when maybe their kids just aren't quite ready yet. They're looking at public schools and the way they do things and thinking, oh my gosh, my kid is behind. I'm not a good homeschooler. And then it starts to translate to the child and brings a lot of fear into the homeschool, which kind of shuts down learning. Like if the
absolutely.
homeschool isn't playful, if on the converse it's very stressful and performance oriented, children pick up on those feelings in the atmosphere and they start acting on that, and then their ability to learn shuts down. And so I love that you were able to keep things so light. I've read other articles about the Finnish schools. I don't know if they've changed it now, but it used to be they didn't start reading until age 7. And the Waldorf schools as well have really, Waldorf, and yeah, they have some great performance outcomes with not starting reading until I think second grade. So same around 7, 8 years old.
Hmm.
One of the things that we do in the Peaceful Press is we just do a lot of like reading books and playing with, doing a lot of motor skills, so fine and large motor skills, but then playing with words, rhyming words, putting letters together, um, make writing poetry like haiku or whatever. So there's a lot of mother or like mother child play with words and letters that I think contributes to just an awareness. But I'd love for you to talk about phonemic and phonetic awareness because I think some moms are like, oh, my child can't recite the ABCs or they can't identify their letters. And in our home, we actually started with just showing them a letter and saying the sound. And it wasn't a lot. Like I would, with my boys, I would show them the letters and they would hop forward for every letter they got right. And, this is a few minutes a day, not hours by any means.
Right.
We would do like little matching games where there'd be a card with a simple short vowel word on it and it would have some kind of command like clap or jump or hop. And once they read the card, they would do the action. Or room labeling games where you'd read a little card and you'd go label the thing, or making their own picture word cards where you'd write a little short word and draw a picture to match. So there was a lot of movement involved in the way that I taught my kids to read because not every child they're everybody learns differently, and for some kids they need a little bit more movement integrated or they need more sight words because their auditory awareness is not quite there. I had a child who's a delayed learner and she needed more sight words because sounding a word out, she would start at the beginning, j, p. But once she got to the p, she'd already forgotten the j because her auditory awareness still needed developing. And so I'd love to just hear from you a little bit about like some of these terms, phonemic and phonetic awareness, and even if you want, just what were the first steps you took when you did start teaching your daughter to read?
Yeah, I love what you said. I'm going to start with I think where a lot of parents get stuck is I really believe that they feel like it needs to be such a formal thing. Like, oh, I've got to sit down for an hour and we've got to drill the letter A. I really believe because that's how public school has really set up how they teach reading. I just want to encourage you, parents that are listening, how natural you can make this exactly like what you just described. I remember, when my firstborn, we would be in the kitchen and I'd be cooking. And, I would be cutting up I would be cutting up a pear. Oh, what rhymes with pear? Let's think. Bear, care. And so taking these very natural moments and making it into a game and not feeling like it has to be such a rigid thing, how naturally it can be when you really start to explore sounds and how to rhyme and what, we would be driving in the car and my daughter would go, "Oh, look, there's an A," or she would, when we first started learning our letter, she'd recognize letters and I go, "A, ah, you're right." And just we would do this in these very natural moments, and those natural moments built and built and built, and it wasn't this super intensive thing, which and then to go back to what you said, there are some children that do need some more targeted intervention. But on that side, and what you noted was something so powerful. The brain, all children's brains, learn the most effectively when you're using a multisensory approach. When you're able to use visual, auditory, tactile, and even smell, all the senses is using different parts of the brain, which makes learning uh, more likely to stick and translate than if you're just, doing something auditorily or just doing something visual. And I loved using that approach, whether I do have a child with special needs, whether I have a child with special needs or whether I have a typically developing child, it's just good practice because you're going to help their brain. So anytime we can take a learning activity like reading, whenever you choose is the right time for your family, if you can turn this into an interactive activity using tactile, and that's why we see, this has become almost common practice in our homeschool realm. In our little world we see on Instagram, we see the sandboxes with the letter drawing. We see the building A out of beans and fruit and whatever. And this seems like silly fun, just fun, silly things, but this is the real work. When you can translate something into a fun, practical activity, they're using their hands, they're smelling the fruit, they're touching it, they're tasting it, they're tracing the letters with their fingers, they're hearing you say, ah, A. All of these things come together in the brain, and those synapses start connecting and connecting. And that's when you have effective, beautiful learning.
So good. It's so true. My last son, I had done something called spell to write and read with most of my children. And it's based on the Spalding method. So it's very focused on phonics and on, you basically dictate phonograms. So you'd start with just dictating the consonants, and then you dictate the vowels, and you'd say all the vowel sounds, a, or e. And then once they have, you would be dictating, they'd be writing. So it does require, it's more like for a first grader. It's not necessarily for preschool or kindergarten where they're just barely getting a proper pencil hold.
Mm-hmm.
And then that would, then you start dictating words, like short words. And it was, I loved that process or that method because it helped my children be better spellers, because it was always very, like, for instance, if we dictated the word that, I would say at that. And then we'd actually underline the TH so they started to understand, oh, here's a two letter, here's a blend, here's a digraph, this is a phonogram that says something differently than TH. And
Mm-hmm.
so I feel like it helped them be better spellers because they started identifying, what we would say the 70 phonograms in the Spalding method.
Mm-hmm.
But with my last son, we were doing a little bit more. And again, I didn't start early. Like in preschool, we were doing things like the Peaceful Preschool, tracing letters, reading lots and lots of stories, playing with letters, playing with, matching words and pictures. We have a free picture word card pack, or there's a $5 picture word card pack and a free phonogram bingo, but playing lots of games and, reading books like yours where it's a single word and picture, and really like running my finger under the word as I read it to them. So there was a lot of just like playing with words and not a lot of pressure. And this last son, we did incorporate a little bit more all about reading, probably just the first book, and mainly because his motor skills weren't as strong. And so for him, it was easier to put the words together with the little tiles than it was to write the words himself. And I think, every child is like, their development is happening on a different plane. And so the same method is not going to work for every child. I know a lot of people use 100 easy lessons, how to teach your child to read in 100 easy lessons. And for us, that was so boring and kind of overwhelming. And so every child is just different. It's going to happen at a different time, a different method even. But like you said, probably the later you start, the faster they'll learn, because when they're ready, it comes easily. Whereas when you're starting too early and putting too much pressure on, it takes the joy out. But what ended up happening with my son is he mainly learned to read through Explode the Code workbooks. They're so easy for parents to use, and it's like you circle things. It doesn't require in the first books a lot of writing words, which some kids aren't ready for. They're ready for underlining or tracing or maybe circling things. And that was a great resource for him. So I think partly it does take, like you said, knowing your child, knowing their readiness, and taking, dialing back the pressure. So what would you say to those moms who are having people come to them and say, oh, your child is 6, they're not reading yet, they're behind? Like, how did you resist that pressure?
Oh man, okay. You know your child best. It is so easy to let peer pressure of what everybody else is doing, and I think us that are already in the homeschool world have gotten pretty good at this. But this is a skill of turning everything off and looking directly at your child, and each one of your own children's different, and really paying attention to what are their needs. My firstborn was definitely, I knew she was going to be more academic. She came out more of that analytical, left-brained. So I looked at her and I thought, she's going to learn to read in a second. Therefore, I need to stop that and push her into that creative zone to develop that right hemisphere of her brain, knowing she's going to lean more left brain. I'm going to push her in her social skills, in her creativity skills, and we're going to really put this off because I know she's going to get it. I know her that well. My next child, not my son that has special needs, but my other daughter, she came out much more creative. She's going to be a little bit more like me, but a little bit more loosey-goosey, and not so much of that analytical brain. So I could see, she's 4 now, I can see maybe we might start just a tiny bit earlier on some of those more, really working towards reading potentially a little bit more earlier than my first, maybe not. I'm just going to play it out and see. But my point to this is that you know your child's needs. You knew your child had some learning struggles, and you knew you were going to have to bridge that gap maybe earlier than later so that you could head off your child getting behind potentially. You also learned a lot about movement and gross motor skills and how important that is for brain development, which ultimately sets the foundation for reading skills. And so I think I really want to encourage you parents that are listening that all of these things that you're doing, reading on the daily to your child, letting them have plenty of playtime and movement, incorporating all your early learning with play and physical, things that are physical and movement related, those are setting the stage, building the brain. They're not just buying your time. It's not just, oh, we're letting them play and then we'll do school. No, that you are doing the hard work of preparing their brain to be ready to read when they're ready to read.
Yeah.
And I really believe that you will know as their parent when that time comes, when that time is.
Absolutely. I love that. One of the things that we really emphasized in all of our homeschool resources with the Peaceful Press is just reading to your children, because then no matter what age they learn to read, they're going to have the vocabulary. I think a big part of, learning to read early is that then you have more years to read beautiful books. And I was just reading an article this morning about how the more you read for pleasure, the bigger your brain gets. And I don't know if there's like, I'm sure there's a stop to that. Like it doesn't just keep growing out right out of your head. But it was really interesting, this article talking about, how reading does increase your brain mass even. And so when you're reading to your children, they're still getting those imaginative stories. They're still getting those virtuous stories. They're still getting that input that's going to help shape their worldview and, just expand who they are in so many ways. And so there doesn't have to be a delay just because you have a child who's learning to read later. There doesn't have to be, they do poor on the SAT or something because they learn later. It's not like that. When you're reading aloud, they're getting that those same benefits as if they were reading to themselves. And so then you just keep working on, and that was why, thinking about those motor skills, those auditory skills, like when you read to them and then they tell you back what you read, that's one of the ways that you're increasing the auditory awareness that it takes to understand how to sound out a word. And when you're playing a game together, when you're, like playing a game, we have something called Husker Du. It's not even available anymore, but you have to pick up these little pegs and move them around the board, or even things like Candyland. Like when you're having to count little spaces, that's a tracking activity that's going to help them with tracking words on a page. So all of the things that we're doing in the Peaceful Press resources as you're playing with your children are helping them develop those underlying skills. But Tabitha, I'd love to have you for a minute just talk about a couple of your favorite of your books, because I love your books for a couple of reasons. Like I love to watercolor paint. And like I said earlier, one of the activities we've done with our children is have them make their own little word books. Like they would copy a word and draw a picture to go with it. And it would be like their own sort of first words book. And your books lend so well to that. Or even, nature journaling. Like if you have a child who wants to be a beginning nature journaler, your books have these beautiful watercolor paintings that are a little more approachable to copy than something from like going out and looking at a tree and copying it, or even a picture of a tree. So I'd love to just hear, what are a couple of your favorite of your books?
Oh goodness. Well, I have a lot of vocabulary books, but all of my books, I hope and I intend, grow with your child and can even grow up into some of those older years. So even my one picture to one word vocabulary books in the back, they all have go find an animal that's pink. Go find an animal that has stripes. So all of my books are encouraging the parent and the child to continue to grow with these books. And then, like you said, I hear so often that older children are using them for more art related lessons and even story prompts like, okay, let's flip through this vocabulary book, and whatever page you land on, you have to do a story about a bear. Um, and so I think these are really unique ways, and I think that's what lends the more realistic type images to growing with your child. But if I had to pick one book, I have a book that I wrote called Wishy Washy, and it's about a little chipmunk. It seems kind of silly and fun, but it's very, very intentional. I wrote it specifically for those babies and children that are learning first words and learning and really talking for the first time. So this might be, your 1 to 2 year olds even, but it can be used as they grow. But almost all of these early books, I even consider what words I choose based on the sounds in these words. So, an example is I might choose the word pony instead of horse because S is a later developing sound that comes as a child develops. P and N and pony are some of those very first developing sounds. And so a child is more likely to attempt a word and say it correctly, which is going to build their confidence. It's going to make mom go, "Oh my goodness, she said pony." As opposed to maybe a more like a typical development would be whore and maybe drop off the R on the S. Or nay nay. They might say nay nay. That's more
Right.
developmentally appropriate. So I strategically choose a lot of words in a lot of my books to build success for some of those babies and children learning to actually speak.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful idea my daughter had a speech delay, and it's still a difficulty for this special needs child. And one of the things that's like such a core memory for me of her early childhood is she was singing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. It was so beautiful. She was little, and it was like, tinkle, tinkle, it'll dar, how me know me where me are. It's so sweet. Um, so yeah, wonderful, wonderful advice. I know families are going to be so encouraged to teach their children to read gently and at the right time and not feel any pressure. Just take the pressure off mamas, because your children will learn to read. Even my like special needs child eventually learned to read and has read Shakespeare and
Wow.
Dickens, and she's an avid reader. So thank you so much, Tabitha, for sharing your wisdom. We'll link the books in the show notes, and we'll link a few other resources for helping you teach your children to read in a timely and child developmentally appropriate manner.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.